Hello, everyone. And welcome. I'm Wendy Kopp. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Teach for All, and I'm so glad that you've joined us for this discussion. All over the world, teachers and school leaders are at the center of how our societies respond to change, from new technologies to more diverse classrooms. And they're also, as we know, playing such a very critical role alongside families in shaping our future. So this is why this discussion is so important. The TALIS 2024 survey surfaces the perspectives of 280,000 teachers from 55 countries and geographies on what they're experiencing in their classrooms and schools, what brings them satisfaction, where they're stretched, how they're thinking about the needs of their students and the new opportunities like artificial intelligence. These findings are so important, in part because of all the evidence we have that teacher well-being matters for the well-being of our students. And by capturing their perspectives, TALIS helps us see what needs to evolve if we want an education system that develops our students holistically, their academic skills and their social and emotional skills, so that they can shape a better future for themselves and for all of us. I am very honored to be facilitating this conversation with Andreas Schleicher, the Director for Education and Skills at the OECD, whose leadership has done so much to enable this global learning. So Andreas, handing it over to you to share some of the key findings from the TALIS.
Thank you so much, Wendy, and thanks for hosting this. You've been such a great champion for advancing the teaching profession, and this is really what these results are about. You know, there is a lot of talk about teachers on many quarters, but we rarely ask teachers and school leaders themselves about how they see the work organization, environment, the support they receive. That's what the survey is about. It's based, as you explained, Wendy, on representative samples of teachers and school leaders. So we can trust that what you see here in numbers reflects what teachers in the respective countries, say and think. And with that, I want to just, open my presentation. I hope you can see it. Just a few words on the TALIS survey itself. It is perhaps not the only, but certainly the largest comparative survey of teachers and principals. And it's done primarily on middle schools, but we also have, for a group of countries, data on primary schools and high schools. When you look at what TALIS captures, it looks at the personal factors that shape teaching, but also the context in which teachers work. And that's very, very important. Are we attracting the most talented teachers to the most challenging classrooms? Those kinds of interactions between personal and contextual factors are really important. We look at job demands, the workload, the pressure students face, as teachers face. We look at the resources they have, the opportunities to learn, their agency, their leadership, their employment status, and the personal resources they bring, their sense of self-efficacy and ownership, their mindset. Do they see, difficulties as an opportunity for growth, their motivation? And then we look at the outcomes, the teaching outcomes, the sense of well-being of teachers, the satisfaction with their jobs, and then, what happens with their intentions to progress in their career or sometimes to rather leave school. So let me start with the latter. Are teachers happy? When you read the news, you often get the impression, there is a profession in crisis. People are leaving their jobs. They are facing unsurmountable difficulties. Students are getting more difficult, and so on. But that's perhaps the voice of the loudest teachers. But when you actually survey countries on a representative basis, you get a quite different picture. First of all, job satisfaction generally is actually quite high. Most people love their jobs. Most teachers love their jobs, despite all difficulties they face. And you can see here in a number of countries, job satisfaction has increased. In some, it decreased. In most, it remained rather stable. So despite all the challenges of the last few years that teachers all around have faced, including the pandemic and so on, you could see actually the high motivation that teachers bring with them, the high job satisfaction pretty much held its ground. When you look at that in a little bit more detail, again, high satisfaction overall with their job. Most teachers, three-quarters, would also say, the advantages of being a teacher sort of outweigh the disadvantage. If I could decide again, again, three-quarters of teachers would say, yeah, I'll do this again. And what I also found really encouraging that 9 out of 10 teachers on average across these 55 countries say, I like to work in my school. I enjoy working in this school. Many of them also say, I recommend my school. So the place of work, the environment, the social environment, the colleagues, all of that is generally viewed quite positively. You ask yourself, what predicts job satisfaction? I'm going to come back to some of the material resources, salaries and so on, but they are not that strong in predicting outcomes. What really matters is the relationship with leadership. Having a principal who's a great instructional leader, where the relationship is very, very strong with staff, you can see that is actually a powerful predictor for job satisfaction. Not surprisingly, the relationship with students also matters for job satisfaction. In some countries more here on the left side, in some countries a little bit less, but you can say it's almost visible anywhere. The quality of relationships really matters a lot for people being confident, happy with their jobs. Of course, teachers experience stress as well. You can see about, 1 in 5 teachers say, I experience stress in my work. By the way, that's actually not, it's actually quite modest when you compare that with many other professions. I think that's not something that we should, look at extraordinary. It exists. It's something that needs to be addressed. And as you can see later in the results, there are ways to address it, but it's not out of the ordinary. You can see it. Some teachers say, my job negatively impacts on my mental health. That's 1 in 10, or even on my physical health. So there are certainly issues that we need to, talk about, need to address that come out quite clearly. What's also important is that stress levels are not equally distributed. You can see, unfortunately, teachers in disadvantaged schools often are more stressed. You look here, at New Zealand, at Hungary, at Costa Rica, United States. You end up in a school that is in difficulties, and rather than, getting, extra support, extra kind of help to do, you get actually often greater difficulties and feel more stressed. And we also going to see later that it's often the less experienced, the youngest teachers who end up in these most difficult schools. And that's, where Teach for All are such champions. They actually actively take on that challenge. They're not just saying, look, this is my only school I can work in, but they say, I want to make a difference to those students. But, there is a price for that. And I think that's something that we should, take account of. How can we, balance those things out in better ways? Stress levels have increased. That's quite clearly visible in a good number of countries. They have also declined in a few countries. But overall, I think you can see a number of countries where we have bigger issues than we had last time when we measured this, which was in 2018. Ask yourself, what is it that actually stresses teachers? Now, that's the next big question. And there are some really interesting insights on that. The number one stressor is actually not related to work with people. In fact, all of the factors that relate what teachers working with people come up pretty low on stress levels. What teachers report stresses them most is, doing things like correcting student work or doing general administrative work. And I'm saying that because it's actually not such a large amount of time that teachers spend on that. In some countries it's 5, 6, maybe 7%. It's not that this dominates their work, but it's perceived to be as something that is extraneous to their work, that takes time away from the things they really like to do, like working with students, doing their work with parents, and so on. So I think that's something that we should take into account. Maybe this is an area where technology can become a game changer, freeing up teachers from the kind of things that they feel, get into the way of their work. Now, we can also see, communication and cooperation with parents can be a source of stress. And that's understandable because a lot of that communication today is still, problem driven, not asset driven. And you talk to parents when there's an issue, and then you get into a defensive situation and so on. So I think that's something we need to look at countries where those relationships work out better. And then, planning, counseling students, teamwork with colleagues. Those things are not the big stresses. And so once again, it's largely things that teachers do not feel are part of the mission why they became teachers. Also, an important question for us is, have things got worse? And you can see in a few countries there has been an increase in overall workload. You can see that particularly visible in Korea, in Brazil, in Lithuania. But there's an equal number of countries where workload has decreased. Japan used to be by a large margin number one, where teachers reported to work, around 60 hours per week, largely on things that were not related to classroom teaching, and the country has been quite successfully reducing that. So now they end up with 55 hours. It's still quite a lot, but in most countries, you talk about 40 hours, according to what teachers say themselves, and it's been pretty stable. So in most countries, teachers' workload has been pretty stable from what we have seen before. I want to come more to what teachers actually do. And what we see is that managing classroom discipline is in many countries quite an important issue. You can see, for example, in most countries, the share of teachers who say that they often, or always need to calm students who are disruptive has risen. Now that's clearly becoming a bigger issue. A couple of countries where it's declined, in some countries it's been stable, but clearly student disruption, discipline is on the rise. We can't, detect the origins of that. This is just the perception of what teachers feel, but underpinning this, could be many things, from physical disruptions to technology getting into the way, to maybe lack of relevance of what students learn and so on. So there could be many things, but it's a changing reality. And what you can also see very, very clearly is that maintaining discipline is a very important predictor. In fact, the most important predictor of teachers' intention to quit their job. Is not necessarily about their own resources, money, and time, and so on. It's dealing with students that they feel I'm not succeeding with this. So maintaining discipline is a big reason to quit teaching. Then comes workload related things, but then again afterwards student teaching students with diverse learning needs. Teachers feel that the expectation to personalize learning has risen so much faster than their capacity to address the different needs of different students and the resources they have for that. So you can see also that becomes then a predictor of intending to leave the profession. At the very bottom is keeping up with reforms, accountability. I found that really interesting because, again, in the debate, that often comes up, things change too quickly, or, I'm responsible for student results. But you look at the data, in most countries, that's not the dominant predictor of, quitting your job. Of course, in all of these things, as you can see here, the gray dot show you the dispersion. There's a huge variability on this across countries. In some countries, teachers get stressed by different things, and that has maybe to do with the underlying practices in those countries. Turning a bit more to the material resources, is teaching an attractive job? And the most obvious dimension to this is about salaries. And you can see in actually most countries, the satisfaction of teachers with their salaries has increased. And in a few countries, it has dropped. In many it has remained stable. And that's really interesting because in many countries, there have been efforts to give teachers fairer pay. In most countries, OECD countries, I must say, for which we have data, teacher pay is not great. Teacher pay in most education systems is not competitive with what you would get with a similar kind of occupation. But again, there have been efforts to improve that situation in many, many countries. And in some, you can see that actually also reflected in the satisfaction levels now. But I alluded to this already. We do not see almost any relationship between the salaries that teachers get and their job satisfaction. You find countries all over the place. Some countries where salaries are great, teachers are happy. Some countries where salaries are great, teachers are unhappy. Some countries where salaries are poor and still, a good level of job satisfaction. So I think that's something that gives us to think that, money is an obvious extrinsic demotivator. If you don't pay people, they're going to run away, obviously. But money is rarely an intrinsic motivator to, get people into the teaching profession and keep them in the teaching profession. We need to think beyond the material resources to the work organization, the environment, the professional empowerment, the collaborative culture, all of those kinds of things. And you can see also here again, what is associated with job satisfaction has to do with disciplinary issues, coping with the kind of problems that you experience, to some extent with volume of teaching. Again, also here comes through teaching students with diverse learning needs. Now, those kinds of issues are more closely related to teacher job satisfaction than just, the material resources. At the beginning, I talked about the relationship with principals, with school leaders, with students. All of those things do really matter. I want to come to an issue that is more about education systems. And I know that's very, very close to the heart of you, Wendy, and Teach for All. Are we mobilizing the best expertise to actually reach the students with the greatest needs? Now, if you come from a privileged background in your life, you're always going to have open doors. Now, whatever happens, even if you're not successful in school, but if you come from a disadvantaged background, you often have just a single chance in life, and that is, find a great teacher and a good school. If you miss that boat, all our data shows, you're going to face an uphill struggle in life. So how well are our systems dealing with this and aligning resources with needs? And for a start, issues are rising. You can see in many countries, there's more movement around the world, more refugees coming into their country. Very few countries where this is on the decline, but you can see there are countries where this is now the new normal. Special needs. More students are diagnosed with special needs. You can see that sort of also big on the increase. No country with a decrease. We do not know to what extent this is, actually reflecting increases in the share of students with special needs. Many countries have also become more nuanced with diagnosing this. So we do not know really what this says, but what it means is that teachers are more expected than in the past to deal with more student diversity. And that clearly, as you could see before, is a challenge. And this is perhaps the most disappointing chart that I'm showing you. You can see very clearly here is that the teachers who typically end up in the most difficult schools are the ones who are the least experienced. The youngest teachers, under the age of 30, or, the teachers with less experience. And there you can see our education systems are often regressive in their resource allocation. The experienced teachers take the easy jobs. They end up in the schools with the most privileged students. The less experienced, the younger teacher, face the really great difficulties. This is clearly an area where our education systems could improve a lot. Couple of exceptions. I highlight Vietnam here. This is a country that has been extremely successful in, intentionally aligning resources with needs. Building, challenge into career mobility. Making sure that when you advance in your career, you take on a tougher situations. pairing high and low performing schools so that they can share their expertise and so on. So Vietnam is a good example of an education system that has been quite successful in doing that intentionally. Japan, Shanghai in China, very similar. They also are very, very sort of intentional about, where do we allocate the teacher in the next job rotation? First of all, they do rotate people across jobs. So you stay in a school for a certain number of years, but then when you move, the system tries to work with you to where can your expertise make most of a difference. But unfortunately, as you can see here, these are exceptions. The rule is that, we need to do a lot better to align resources with needs. Let's have a short look beyond academic outcomes. We ask teachers, what are the kind of things where you feel really successful in addressing your lesson aims? And you can see, 9 out of 10 teachers say, yeah, I can teach with clarity. That's what I intended. I achieved that. Consolidate the knowledge among the students, providing feedback. And then the bars get shorter. Cognitive activation, we know that's the key for learning outcomes. Do you get students genuinely engaged? Do students take ownership over their learning objectives, monitor their learning progress? Those kinds of things. You can see the bars get short. Classroom management, also there, many teachers struggle. And then adapting lessons to different learning needs. And finally, supporting students' social emotional learning, which many people would acknowledge is actually a very important central task of teachers today. Teachers who are not just good instructors, but also good coaches, good mentors, great facilitators, creative designers of, adaptive, innovative learning environments. Then you can see on the more traditional aspects, teachers feel quite confident. They think, I can do what I want to do. But on those things that perhaps matter more in the times in which we live, the bars are too short. There's more that we need to do according to what teachers say. Of course, also this varies enormously across countries. What's interesting is that this is one of the few areas where we see massive gender differences. On average, female teachers are much more likely to use the practices that actually address students' social and emotional needs and develop their skills in this area. Now, the difference is particularly pronounced in countries like Spain, like Iceland, like Canada. There are also countries where it's not statistically visible, no, but it's an area where the gender really comes into play. New technologies, no, artificial intelligence is on everybody's mind. To what extent is it reaching schools? Well, again, let's start by asking teachers for their views and perspectives on this. And you can see about, 30-40% of teachers say that they have been using AI in the classroom. Again, huge variability, a world of difference between a country like France or, countries like United Arab Emirates or Singapore. But on average, it's 30-40% of teachers. Most teachers, the majority of teachers would also say that, AI can help to write or improve my lesson plan. So they see this as a source of inspiration, of preparation, or that AI can enable the adaptation of learning materials for my students. Now, that's something that teachers would agree. But you can see there's also healthy skepticism. The good majority of teachers, over 70% say, AI may lead my students to plagiarize, or it may make incorrect or inappropriate recommendations. So I think those concerns are quite real. And obviously, teachers have a clear point. So the views of teachers are quite mixed. There are some concerns, but they use it anyway. And you can see here a comparison of this. Again, I already said, UAE, Singapore are the kind of leaders where AI has, virtually entered every classroom. And then France, but also Japan coming up at the very end. So huge variability. And I'm saying this because AI is a technology that has been present in every country almost instantly, at the very same time. But you can see the incorporation into teaching has varied a lot across countries. I already said, concerns are also dominant, and even in countries that are doing quite well, you look at Estonia and Singapore, Korea, countries that are leaders, that doesn't mean that there are not many teachers who share some of the concerns that I've just raised. Interesting also is, do I use AI for my own professional advancement? And also there are huge differences. Singapore, the UAE, also here the leaders, where it's natural for teachers to use AI for their own professional learning. And then you can see France at the very bottom of that, where you have, less than 1 in 10 teachers who say I used AI for my professional learning in the last year. I must say that this data were collected in 24 last year, so there could be some changes here, but we don't know to what extent it has really entered in our classrooms. What's also clear is that online and hybrid instruction are here to stay. We thought it was a stopgap solution during the pandemic, but you can see in most education systems, it is still part of the reality. That was about technology, but school work in classrooms is about a lot more things. And I want to touch on something that is very, very central to both the job satisfaction and the effectiveness of teachers. And that has to do with professional autonomy. And professional autonomy only works in a collaborative culture. We all know that from research, where you have professional autonomy without sharing and collaboration, you end up atomizing your systems and isolating teachers. Now, it's this combination of professional autonomy and a collaborative culture that is the secret to a good workplace in school. So let's look at those factors in combination here. First of all, you can see very clearly is that having autonomy is actually a good predictor of teacher job satisfaction. The only countries where this is not clearly visible are the United States and Norway. Very hard to understand, but in most countries you can say if you actually get a little bit more autonomy, you're much more likely to be happy with your with your job. One way of exercising autonomy and the collaborative culture is by having teachers being part of school management teams. Now, this is the kind of distributed leadership that we often talk about. And you can see on the left side, some countries where this is quite well established, but you also see on the right side where that is very uncommon, where leadership is still very much about, the principal and not so much about teachers becoming engaged with this. What's interesting is that teachers themselves appreciate the opportunity to participate in school decisions. Now, again, when you look at the relationship, teachers taking part in this distributed leadership and their job satisfaction, you can see in almost all countries, actually in all countries, there is positive correlation. What's interesting for us is that this correlation remains after you discount for teacher and school characteristics. So it's not just a feature that comes indirectly through the school environment, but there seems something that being part of this shared culture of decision-making increases my satisfaction with my job. Finally, and that's perhaps naturally teachers with a greater sense of self-efficacy report more leadership opportunities. Now, we do not know what's cause and effect here. It could be that where we have more opportunities for leadership, teachers develop a greater sense of self-efficacy, the capacity to overcome challenges and the confidence in that. Could be that, where the focus is more on enabling teachers and building that self-efficacy, that then, people pick up more opportunities for leadership. But what is important that there is a relationship between the two. Let's go to the system and ask yourself not just what can I do in my school, but to what extent is my voice as a teacher heard in my education system among policymakers? And this is quite encouraging. You can see there is a larger number of countries where this has gone up than where it has gone down. So in a way, it tells us that the numbers are still not very good, still quite low, but there is a perception among many teachers that governments, public policy is starting to listen to us. There are many more means to this. In fact, in my organization, the OECD, is hosting, or is together with Education International every year, a summit of the teaching profession, where we bring together, ministers and union leaders to discuss some of those issues that are very, very tough and difficult to resolve. But at least, to give the profession a voice is very, very important. And interestingly, you can see here an education system like Vietnam, very strong on that, but also the UAE, Saudi Arabia, where actually there is at least a sense among teachers. People will listen to me in the system. Things might change. There are other countries where that, sense is very, very low. That's about the autonomy side. Let's look more at the cooperation side. And what you can see here also is a lot of variability. The first thing that you will notice is that the kind of more, I would call them superficial ways of collaboration, just sharing materials, having a discussion with teachers, and also with other teachers in the school, that is quite common. Now, that's the lower part of the chart. People in school, teachers are social people. They work with their colleagues. But when you look at the more profound, the deeper ways of professional collaboration, do you teach together? Do you actually take part in collaborative professional learning? Do you engage in joint activities? Do you observe other teachers' classes? There you can see suddenly the bars get much shorter. It's much less common. Why do I emphasize this? Because our data show it's these deeper levels of professional engagement, professional collaboration, that actually are the predictors for teachers' self-efficacy, being effective as a teacher, and for teachers' job satisfaction. So it's not just about, making teaching more collaborative. It's much more about shifting collaboration from just, exchange and sharing to actually working together to frame good practice and to take, ownership for the profession. Good news is that actually this has improved. Again, in no country have we seen a decline. That's quite remarkable. In many countries have we seen improvement on teamwork and dialogue with other teachers. So maybe education systems gradually are moving towards this goal of greater autonomy in a more collaborative culture. Why is this important? Because teachers like it. You can see again here, working together is a good predictor of teacher job satisfaction. The final part in the presentation has to do with value and also with how do teachers actually advance in their careers. And that's something, where we have a lot of question marks. When you ask teachers about, how useful has college and teacher education been for you? You see only two countries where there is an improvement. This is basically Saudi Arabia and in the region of Shanghai in China. In most countries, it's gone down or, it has not changed. I'm not saying necessarily that, the quality of teacher education has declined, but maybe the perception of its relevance, maybe, what you did before you entered school has become too distant from the reality that you face today in the classroom, artificial intelligence, students with different needs, all of those are emerging challenges, and maybe the kind of education that you got, at the beginning of your career has been too distant from us. It tells us maybe we should shift more from, preparing teachers up front towards, making teachers or enabling them to become really good learners on themselves. So I think that's a kind of something that really pushes us to think harder about education. When you ask about, the focus of teacher education, you can see very clearly it's good on traditional topics, knowledge of the subjects, pedagogy of the subjects, student assessment practices, digital resources to some extent. That's where people feel, yeah, teacher education is doing something. But when you look at the more emerging issues, supporting social emotional learning, using artificial intelligence, teaching in a multicultural or multilingual setting, you can see, the dots get much more to the left side. That's not so prominent yet in initial teacher education. So something we should become better. Good news, where teachers feel that my professional learning has been useful, it is actually a good predictor of meeting my lesson aims. And that's, I think, something that we would want to see, that teachers feel, this professional learning actually leads to, achieving the kind of things that are important. And you can see when there is a sense that actually this has been of high quality, you can see it does work. There's in almost every country a positive relationship. Very final set is about, not about teachers, but about society. If the teachers are the engineers of our future, we should, value that role and, cherish them as being the engineers of their future. But when you look at this across countries, very mixed perspective. There's in some countries been an increase in teachers' perception of how their work is valued by society, but an equal number has seen a decline, and in some countries, quite significant declines. You can see, for example, in Korea or in the region of Alberta in Canada. And you also see enormous variation on this now. On the left side, in Vietnam, in Kazakhstan, in the UAE, now you can say, well, a good majority of teachers, 8 out of 10, think, society values the work I do every day. But, I'm living in France at the very bottom of the scale. It's 5 in 100. So it may not be true that, society doesn't care about teachers. It may just be that teachers feel too isolated from this. Now, when you look at the predictors of this perception, a lot of this has to do with social capital. Where teachers are more engaged with parents, work in a more collaborative culture, have better relationship with students. All of those are important predictors for the perception that teachers have. Value in society is always about building and backing social capital. So this is not something that we should see written in stone. And in fact, as you can see, in some education systems, it has improved, which shows us that we can actually do something about it. Do policymakers value the views of teachers? Again, the teachers' perception of that are very mixed, very different across countries. But overall, we have seen a bigger increase than we have seen decline. So that's maybe something, where policymakers, as I already highlighted before, when it comes to, other aspects, maybe policymakers are listening more than they did in the past. Teachers in private schools feel more valued by students. That's interesting. Maybe there's something that we can learn from private schools in terms of building closer relationships, building a kind of, closer ethos of collaboration. Engagement with parents, also hugely variable. Again, you can see Vietnam, where, almost 70% of teachers say I collaborate with parents at least every month. No, but then you can see on the other side of the spectrum in Belgium or Malta or the Netherlands, where it's less than 1 in 10. Why do I say that? Because what you can see very clearly is that more engagement with parents can actually help teachers feel more valued. Is all about the kind of social capital that we build, the quality of relationship that ultimately, shape how satisfied teachers are with their job, but also the perception they have about their value in society. I know this was a lot of material and you find a lot more in the report, but I look forward to our discussion on those issues, Wendy.
Amazing. This is a treasure trove of information. And I wish we had so much time to unpack it all. Maybe we can start. I mean, I was so struck by the idea, the just data that 9 out of 10 teachers are feeling satisfied, that 90% of teachers feel happy while they're teaching. This seems like really encouraging news about just the mission drivenness of the teachers in the profession. I guess, and we learn a lot just from the slides you've already shared, but I'm curious, like if from everything you've seen, if you're an education system or a country, like what are the biggest things you can do to grow your teacher satisfaction? Just like
From
stepping back from it all.
Yeah, I think for me, the big takeaway really is anything you can do to strengthen the kind of professional autonomy and the collaborative culture in the work organization, that teachers get that empowerment, that they are not the recipients of, received wisdom, but that they take ownership of professional practice. They work with their colleagues, they work with parents. Collaboration with parents is not, deficit driven, but asset driven, proactive rather than reactive. I think those kinds of things are such important drivers of teacher self-efficacy, such important drivers of job satisfaction that I do think there's a lot more that we can do. And I say this because the work organization and education is still rather industrial. We
Mm,
talk about a profession, but at the end of the day, there's still many vertical lines of communication and collaboration and actually rather limited, horizontal mechanisms. And I think of knowledge sharing, of collaboration. I actually think, the Teach for All network for me is one of the world's most advanced systems in this place, creating that kind of infrastructure that allows teachers to become part of a profession. But I think if you wanted to have one factor, for me, that's the main takeaway from TALIS, from all of the data that I've seen. I've
mm,
become much more, reserved about all the structural issues,
mm.
from salaries to class sizes and so on. There's not really a lot that you can see in this data.
Yeah, really interesting. Let's get into some of it was really interesting to see the perceptions of student discipline being more challenging. And I guess we're just theorizing here, but you've seen so much over time. And I'm curious how you think about it. I guess in our experience, when there are student discipline issues, it's usually that the students aren't engaged. So I guess my head goes to the question of, is school seeming less relevant to kids today, um, to the actual challenges in the world? But I'm curious what your kind of hypotheses are.
There's very little that you can derive from the TALIS data directly on that. But if you look at, other research, other surveys, if you look at PISA, I would also put this, loss of relevance as number one. When you ask students themselves in PISA, for example, there's a growing share of students who think, school has been a waste of time. It is not related to what I'm interested in, what I need for my future. And I think in the past, teachers had a natural authority. They were the source of wisdom, the source where students were oriented. Discipline comes out of that. Today, teachers are one out of many sources that students have of knowledge. And if education doesn't remain relevant, it's going to be harder and harder to keep students just with, measures of control, like, exams, a discipline. I do think, this loss of relevance is a grave concern. And you can see that on so many things. You can see that about, teacher education. Teachers themselves say that their own education is less relevant today than it used to be. And I think we should, really take note of that and make sure that, what we do with students is interesting, is engaging from them. That cognitive activation is really at the heart of this. And technology can maybe help with this, but not automatically. This could also actually amplify this trend that it leads to more cognitive disconnect and cognitive laziness and outsourcing of the personal contact and relationships. So I think we have to, yeah, look for really compelling mean. I would still think great teachers are very good in designing learning environments where students can do things, where
Yeah.
where the students themselves are part of that process rather than just the consumers of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I think this relates in a way. It was interesting to see that the lowest rating from teachers in terms of what they feel equipped to do is to build social emotional skills. And I'm curious, I mean, I guess in our experience, and my fear is that people are going to look at this result and just add things on to teacher development or add things on to student schedules to try to get at that rather than really step back and look at the questions of I guess in our experience we've seen shifts in teacher orientation and teacher mindsets, how they see their students, seeing their students as whole people who can lead today and exercise agency, seeing themselves as learners alongside their students rather than the sage on the stage, and seeing their fundamental purpose as teachers as being to develop their students holistically so that they're equipped to shape a better future. Those, lead to kind of a different way of teaching, like
Mm.
different teaching practices that ultimately integrate, I guess, the social emotional development with the academic um, mastery. And I'm curious, I don't know, what do you take from that result, I guess? And where do you think that should lead us?
It's so interesting. Teaching social emotional skills is so much easier than teaching academic skills. Helping students to develop empathy or social skills is so much easier than helping them to understand calculus and trigonometry. But, it is still quite foreign to our systems. And as you rightly say, we often put those things as opposing ends on a long spectrum. If you focus more on social emotional skills, you take time away from, academic excellence, you end up in a compromise. We should, much more see those things as two sides of the same coin. How we develop academic excellence through social emotional skills rather than at the expense of those skills. And there are countries that are actually quite good at that. We have, again, that's difficult to derive from TALIS, but we have in PISA good data on all of that. And you can see, for example, you look at a country like Korea, where you can clearly see academic excellence comes at the expense of social emotional skills. But you look at a country like Denmark, where the students are pretty good on all of those dimensions. So I think actually we can reconcile it. And I do think that most teachers have a natural inclination to do so. If you ask teachers in TALIS, why did you become a teacher? Most teachers put first, I want to make a difference to the lives of students, of young people. And so if we give them better tools, if we give them more discretion to design learning environments that actually reconcile the academic and social emotional development, I think we're going to be so much more successful. If you teach sports, don't just focus on helping students become more athletic, but use sports as an opportunity to develop responsibility for yourself, for others, courage, leadership, all of those kinds of things. And actually, I do think in the end of the day, it's going to strengthen academic outcomes, not weaken them.
Mhm. Helpful. I'm going to ask one more question and then get to some of the audience questions. I was encouraged to see the AI usage, and I'm curious though how you view it. I mean, I guess there's so many risks to AI as we've all acknowledged around everything from child safety to maybe possibly preventing students from deeper learning to equity challenges. And I guess our view, and yet there are huge advantages, as we know. I mean, they could help us personalize learning for students, they can save so much teacher time. And our belief is that if we can get teachers who are committed to equity and have strong pedagogy, committed to students' holistic development, driving the AI and education revolution, that will enable it to be a force for good. And so this was really encouraging, I thought, that in so many countries, even in 2024, such a high percentage of teachers were leveraging it. But curious what you're seeing and even maybe what's different in the countries where we're seeing the usage rate is highest.
Yeah, I think it's good that teachers see both the opportunities and the risks. There's a quite nuanced perception of teachers, that AI can, get students to just outsource their thinking and lead to more superficial learning, all of those things. At the same time, teachers do see the opportunities it provides to make learning more granular, more adaptive, more interactive, but also for their own professional growth. In fact, the strong relationship between teachers engaging in learning themselves and using AI in the classroom for me is a sign of that. I actually, try to study that in order to sort of become better in using that. I think there is a quite, I think good possibility that AI will become a force for good. I think we should always realize that AI is not a magic power. It's just an amazing accelerator, an incredible amplifier. It's going to amplify good pedagogical practice and it can accelerate poor practice. It can
Mhm.
make you an amazing designer of innovative learning environments or, the slave of some scripted lesson plan. And I
Yeah.
think where you navigate this is going to depend on, the teaching profession. And I find, in many countries, the data quite encouraging that there's clearly, positive engagement with that agenda.
Mhm. Let me bring in a few of these questions from the audience. I'm seeing one from Danielle Fano, who's asking, have you explored the relationship of these TALIS indicators and the PISA results? And are there plans to do that?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. We can certainly do that at the system level. We can look at education systems that have certain strengths in the teaching force and see, how do the strengths play out at the system level in student learning outcomes, the cognitive outcomes, social emotional outcomes. And that's, I think, relatively easy to do. We've tried to link the surveys at the school level for a number of countries some years ago. That proved to be more difficult simply because those relationships are so complex that they're very, very difficult to capture empirically. But I do think you can see quite clear patterns. Now, the kind of teaching practices that you see in high-performing education systems, systems that do well on PISA, I think there are some really good patterns, and I think that's a cautious, but I do think defensible use of those relationships.
Yeah. John Bangs at Education International is asking, will there be subsequent OECD policy recommendations based on the data?
Yeah, I mean, along the lines I already tried to highlight in this, we will not tell countries what they should be doing, but I think what TALIS does well is it tells countries what other countries are doing and with what effect. And for me, that's the strongest way of providing advice and recommendations, just to use the world as a laboratory and be very clear of where we see, good and effective practice and where there is more work to do. And then, people need to make up their mind how they, leverage that in their own context. It's very, very hard to, make global recommendations on these kinds of things. It's more about what are the drivers of success and how can you configure those drivers in your own context. That's really, I think, the way TALIS and PISA and the surveys work. So if you understand recommendations in that sense, you're going to see a lot more.
Mm. Um, there's so many questions to choose from. Alexandra Okada at Open University is asking, how can teachers in different countries exchange best practices and access not only quantitative, but also qualitative data and insights?
Yeah, some countries have really, really good mechanisms for this in place. I highlighted before the region of Shanghai in China, where there is a strong digital platforms where teachers, upload their kind of ideas and lesson plans and projects, and where, school leaders would also evaluate teachers very much on the contribution teachers individually make to enhancing the profession and so on. So I think there are some countries with very, very a good culture of system-wide collaboration, because I think what the point made here is a very relevant one. Often collaboration is limited to the four walls of a school. And how do you actually get, that professional collaboration across borders of schools? But I do think there are some really good examples. Overall, I would still say that teaching is still quite far behind of what we see, for example, in the medical profession, where your participation in the profession is probably more important than your work in a specific hospital. And then I think in education we can learn from that. But there are, I think, quite good examples already where you can see the emergence of a profession. I actually think, Wendy, the work that you do in Teach for All is a very important mobilizer of that kind of knowledge at the global level. We have a lot of really good practices that at this moment do not travel simply because we are using different languages, we work in different cultures. We are not really very good in looking outward in our systems. And I think what do you do with the with your institute, Global Institute, is a great step to actually connect teachers and build that kind of fabric of collaboration across borders as well.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's so important. Um, Stephen Farr is making the observation that it's so striking that virtually every condition that fosters teacher satisfaction is what fosters student sort of connectedness and agency and all. Are our teachers and students feeling connected, autonomy, valued, agency, et cetera? I mean, they're so connected to each other. Um, which just, I guess, re-raises the question of it'd be so interesting if we could figure out how to correlate data around teacher satisfaction and how they feel treated with how they actually teach. There's another question here around like, is there any way to gain insight into that, into the correlation between how teachers feel treated and their actual teaching practices?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you can look at, how when you look at this agency that teachers feel and that job satisfaction, you can look at the system factors that are around it. And you can actually, I mean, that would be a legitimate way of comparing with PISA. You can do the same at the student level. And, it is for me not surprising, humans are all about relationships and systems that are doing a better job at the student level. It's hard for teachers to give what they do not have. In a way, I think, it's almost natural that the kind of environment that teachers walk in then reflects on how they interact with the students, and that, is then shaping the student outcomes. But I think this could be a fascinating analysis with those two data sets that could be done.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, maybe last question from Rachel Whitney Smith. Was there data relating to teachers' confidence in preparing students for a world where computational, critical, and creative thinking skills are essential given algorithms, big data, AI-driven systems are becoming everyday part of life?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of material on teacher self-efficacy and that's really what this is about. You can't
Mhm.
name those kinds of challenges, but do you have that confidence as a teacher that whatever happens tomorrow, you'll be ready. You'll be able to sort of get students, on that journey and mobilize their energy. And I think there's a lot in TALIS that tells us about that sense of self-efficacy that teachers face, and also some of the drivers, and they're actually very similar to what we see as the drivers of job satisfaction. But for me, that's perhaps when I look at the outcome, more important than job satisfaction really is that sense of self-efficacy. Do I believe, in my own abilities to whatever the challenges today to see that world of tomorrow. The biggest, difficulty you face as a teacher is that you have to live the future today that you want to see in your students tomorrow. And if you're honest, society is not wisdom with teachers. Parents, get very excited when their students no longer learn what was important to them, and when they learn things they no longer understand. And as a teacher, it's so much easier to teach how you were taught than how you were taught to teach. Clearly, because the environment always pushes you in a kind of regressive way. And even as an education policymaker, you can win an election, you know, rarely with education reform because it translates good things today translate into outcomes so many years later, but you can lose an election when something small goes wrong. So I think the dynamics that teachers are in are really, really tough. You have to see that future, live that future, bring it to your students. And I think if you're good at that, I think that's the biggest sign that we can see as success.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Andreas, for everything that you've shared, all that you're illuminating here, and really for bringing us back to this point that what we have in our classrooms today is what we will have in the world tomorrow. And maybe the most important thing we can do is help all of us adults in the system unlearn how we were taught so that we can prepare kids for today's very fast changing world. So thank you so much. Thank you to everyone out there for all of your engagement, all of your incredible questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but I hope you'll be able to spend time with the TALIS report, which the written report I know shares even more. So thank you for joining today. Thank you again, Andreas, for everything you've done to enable us to learn from each other on this critical topic.
Thank you, Wendy.